older generations, we're desperately trying to catch up to technology, and it sometimes seems like a losing battle, because as soon as we get to figure out the remote control, they go and change it on us, and now it's touchscreen or iPads and iTunes and all of these eyes, and we're probably a bit frantic trying to catch up. So we'll talk about what we can do about that. So what's a bully? Bullies tend to be kids. They tend to range in age depending upon their circumstances. Certainly a lack of empathy. Now, we might tend to think that bullies might have low self-esteem, and that's not necessarily the case. It's really about control. And you know, when we look at these young people, you know, it's a condition of power. It's how are they interacting with their environment. And as we get later into the presentation, we'll see that, you know, our young people are really a product of the environment. And we have probably some unique challenges today in 2011 when we want to kind of address those issues. Interestingly enough, I got some numbers here. 50% of kids, 15 to 18, both public and private schools, have experienced some sort of bullying. 50%. I mean, that's quite an astonishing number. And what I thought fascinating yesterday about the president, he said that bullying should not be considered a rite of passage, that it shouldn't be accepted or tolerated in any sense. And I thought that that was very appropriate. I think many times we look at maybe quote-unquote schoolyard behaviors and we dismiss them very easily as, well, that's just kids being kids. And we're learning that these types of behaviors tend to have some pretty severe consequences. 52% had hit someone in anger. I thought that was another kind of shocking statistic. 52%, or half the kids that hit someone in anger. 30% of boys and 19% of girls say it's okay to hit or physically threaten another who anger them. And so what this suggests to me was that we're not doing a good enough job educating our youth on how to handle conflict, how to process these emotions, and certainly the internet makes it a lot more difficult. We'll talk about that as we go along. So let's look at the victims. Who are they? Well, again, same types of kids within that range. The victims are getting younger. Why? Well, we have extended the age down, as it were, to kids that are accessing technology. If you look at young people who are engaged in social media, particularly our favorite site in the clinical world, Facebook. I'm sure most people have heard of Facebook. Probably most of us have Facebook, have interacted with Facebook. There may be even a few of us who are completely anti-Facebook. But Facebook is certainly a large presence in social media. I think the last number I saw was upwards of 500 million active users in any given day. That's just incredible how many people are activating that. Something like 28% of young people are actually accessing their Facebook pages before they even get out of bed in the morning. So it has dramatic effects. You know, parents tend to be pretty shocked when they hear that their kid either has been bullied or is a bully. I don't think that whether or not that's we're just not paying enough attention, or that maybe we come from that generation where some things are maybe easily dismissed. I certainly know, growing up in a very rural community, that bullying was considered kind of a rite of passage. If you got picked on, you know, if you were a boy, you know, your father probably tended to tell you, you know what, punch him back, or, you know, be physically aggressive back. And so as we have kind of shifted to a digital age, you know, this phenomenon of bullying has taken on some new dynamics. Victims tend to be pretty passive, and we're going to talk about why in terms of passiveness, anxiety, maybe a little bit more insecure. I think that as we go through this presentation, you will see that while some profiles may fit, that they're not absolutes. I think that's important to keep in mind, that we don't have any absolute criteria that is going to separate a bully from a non-bully. I think what's fascinating is that any kid could be both. You could have a kid who could be the victim of a bully. You could have that same kid actually be a bully. And certainly with social media, it makes it a lot easier. And we'll talk about the face-to-face aspects of that in a bit. And this is the last bullet, where the small percentage of victims are termed provocative because they're both anxious and aggressive, and so they're actually seeking that attention. Okay, so what makes a secure kid? I think that when we look at studies of aggression, when we look at bullying behavior, the kids that generally get or that report more often that they are victims of aggression or victims of being a bully tend to be a little bit less secure, either with themselves or with the environment. So what makes a secure kid? Well, the environment. The environment really does have a huge role. You know, Piaget talked about developing structure, and I think that we don't, at least in my own experience, I don't think we do enough teaching that to young people or teaching that to parents. Certainly the education system, I have a colleague of mine, he's always fond of saying, what do kids learn in kindergarten? It's like his favorite saying. He goes around, and the first time he asked me that, I was like, okay, is this some esoterical, deep thinking question? Here's this psychologist who's been, you know, doing private practice and all this wonderful work for 30-some years, and I'm this new clinician, and he's asking me, what do kids do in kindergarten? And I thought it was a trick question. I'm like, I get nervous. I don't know. What do they do in kindergarten? He said, well, they really only learn a few things. They learn to sit still. They learn to follow directions. And they learn to interact with each other. I mean, that's really the core of kindergarten, is these kind of very basic life skills, and it provides structure. Provides structure for them. My daughter is just finishing up kindergarten, and it's actually quite true. They learn to sit still, sit on the square, sit on your number. They learn to pay attention, and then they learn to interact with one another. And then that kind of sets the stage and shapes them for those future grades. I think the challenge is as kids progress through education, they tend to maybe lose some of that structure. And as educators, as providers, we tend to be limited to a very short amount of time with that individual. So the burden then falls on the parents and that family structure, or that family dynamic, to provide that structure for young people. You know, we look at, we look at these mental maps or schemas, and this is how young people are developing as they experience the world around them. They tend to form an idea of, okay, where do I fit? Where do I belong in this kind of big, crazy universe? And what's, I think, singularly unique about this next generation is they have now grown up with these tremendous advances. I mean, I think for most folks that are in their 30s or younger, or 30s or older, I should say, we can remember a very short period of time not long ago where we really didn't have cell phones. I mean, I remember not having a cell phone. I mean, I remember my first cell phone. It made a call, and not a very good one. You know, it just had numbers on it. And we've evolved and changed so rapidly since then that I think young people, particularly in that 10 to 18 range right now, have grown up with so much technology and so many advances that it's had an effect on how they develop their mental maps, how they develop their schemes of where they fit. Because when I talk to young people, their world really is centered in terms of technology, whether it's the computer, the laptop, or their phone. I like to do a unique kind of, not really an experiment, but it's maybe my perverse sense of humor. When I have kids that are coming out of high school into my community college class, I will have them, when they first come into class, we'll take their pulse, teach them how to take their pulse, and we write it down. And then we'll collect all their cell phones and just set them off to the side. And it's amazing because you will actually, when you retake their pulse, you will see that their pulse rate has increased. They have a tremendous amount of anxiety because they have now been separated from this tiny little piece of plastic that is, for most of us, I mean, we'd probably be pretty happy standing on the beach and just throwing it into the ocean and say, "Good riddance, I'm free of you," and sailing off into the sunset without this kind of constant attachment to the rest of our world. And so as they develop their schema, you know, they really have tremendous, I think, deficits when it comes to interpersonal communications. All right. So this is what's interesting. Children don't want to report what's going on. They're very hesitant to talk about being bullied. And as we kind of look further into it, what we find is that most adults are not taking it seriously enough. That's the message that has kind of gotten out, is that a lot of adults aren't taking this, and I think that's changing. I think yesterday the President's Conference on Bullying certainly brings it to national attention, but you know, prior to 2 years ago, you did not hear anything about bullying in general, very little, certainly not cyberbullying. So it's a very new phenomenon. I've got a study, and I'll give it to Colby to post maybe as an attachment. And this is what the President was going over yesterday. But what I found interesting is this study, it comes from the Cyberbullying Research Center, which I thought was unique because a couple years ago we would have never even heard of the Cyberbullying Research Center, and now we have a center dedicated to researching that. But what was fascinating is they used about 15 sources for this material, and over half of them are dated prior to the launch of Facebook. Facebook launched in 2004, is when it kind of went viral, if you will. And that's really, let me see my math, 4, 6, 7 years ago. I mean, it's a very short period of time. So we haven't, I think as researchers, had enough time to kind of catch up to that. The playground, the cafeteria, restrooms, common locations for a perpetrator to act. And I started thinking about this. Well, as educators, as adults, as clinicians, as parents, as concerned citizens, why aren't we around? Well, playgrounds, you've got hundreds, if not thousands, of kids, so it becomes very difficult for a very small amount of staff to monitor that whole area. Probably very similar with the cafeteria. Restrooms, I think most adults probably don't want to go into a restroom at an elementary school or high school. And so these become areas where these acts take place. And then, unfortunately, with the internet, cell phones, laptops, it can be anywhere now. And I think that that's the real challenge. When we look at how bullying previously took place prior to our digital world, it was very much a face-to-face confrontation. You had to interact. You had to push somebody around, if it were. You had to, confront them. And it was primarily limited to that very small social sphere of influence. If you were at a school, if you were in town somewhere, it didn't go much beyond that. The challenge with the internet and our virtual world is it's now become a virtual world. It's huge. And we look at the amount of pressure that now comes to bear on these young people. We've started to see an increase in suicidal behavior, depression, isolation, anxieties, because it's not just me and that person who was picking on me at the lunchroom or in the cafeteria. It's now everybody in my town, or people that I don't even know from around the area, Facebooking me or sending me text messages or posting things online. So it becomes viral, and it expands very, very fast. So what to do? Well, I think the first thing to do is to take it seriously, to take action. As I said at the beginning, we need to shift away from this is a rite of passage and more to a mindset and a philosophy that aggression and intolerance and these types of bullying behaviors are not acceptable anywhere at any time. It's always amazed me how if you look at grade schoolers, kindergarten, preschool, first grade, second grade, by and large, everybody gets along. So something starts to happen as we get into third and fourth grade, and as kids now begin to grow and mature. I think part of it is they're experiencing all of this rapid development. We have a lot of social issues, education issues that then make it much harder, I think, for us as professionals, whether we're in education or whether we're doing therapy, to try and manage some of these new dynamics. But certainly we want to take action. I think that's the first thing, is take it seriously and take action. Parents have to start teaching their kids. UCLA did an interesting, released I thought was a fantastic study last year on teenage sexuality. And they found that when parents engaged their kids at what was determined to be a mature or mature enough to handle the information age, so depending upon your individual child, that could be maybe as young as 8, maybe as old as 10 or 12, they found that when they started to discuss sexuality in terms of its dangers, and they had a longer conversation that lasted over a longer period of time, that these young people were then much less likely to experience a sexually transmitted disease, engage in premarital sex. I mean, the benefits really were demonstrated. I was just amazed. And what they were trying to say, I think, was we can no longer just have the talk. We can't just sit down and say, okay, son, I'm here to talk to you about the birds and the bees, and any questions? No? Great. Because it makes us very uncomfortable. I think this is very similar when we talk about bullying. We have to engage our children at a young age and continue the conversation. Continue the conversation about how do we handle aggression? How do you react if you're being bullied? How do you react if you see somebody being bullied? What do we do, when we have an encounter with someone? Certainly an air of self-confidence, eye contact, speaking up, telling somebody, I think it's important to remember that technology has made our job harder. We don't have to compete with Leave It to Beaver or the Waltons. We have to compete with Jersey Shore and Desperate Housewives. And kids are exposed to kind of a constant stream of media, both good and bad. Please don't interpret my presentation today as being negative on information and technology. I love it. I love my iPhone. I love my navigation system in my car. I couldn't get anywhere without it. But it certainly has created some unique opportunities. And so when we look at teaching kids these things, I think it has to be a much longer and much more in-depth conversation for them to take hold, and we have to act. Parents of bullies should also intervene, to stop the behavior. We have to make it clear that it can't be tolerated, and B, it shouldn't be ignored. And I think that that's really, really important. This is interesting. 60% of boys who are identified as bullies in grades 6 through 9 had at least one criminal conviction by 24 years of age. And I think this is the information that we have to do a better job of explaining. And if we explain to parents, look, your son has a 60% chance of a criminal conviction by the time he's 24. Because they have learned this method of dealing with aggression that is maladaptive. It is not healthy. Little boys, even little girls. I think if you look at media, you will see an alarming trend of behavior that is demonstrated by adult women that is very inappropriate for young girls. And we see this statistically. We see a rise in convictions. We see a rise in on our probation rolls here in Orange County of young women who are now involved in the legal system as a result of some physical altercation. And I think that that's very disturbing. 35 and 40% of these children had 3 or more criminal convictions by that same age. Counseling is helpful, certainly in terms of underlying depression or conduct disorder. We have to do a better job, I think, of educating our parents, because it really does start there. As educators, as psychologists, we have a limited amount of time with young people. We just do. And so if we're not educating our parents, if we're not increasing that knowledge and allowing them to have those conversations, I think, longer, I think we do a disservice. All right. Students who bully others often want to minimize it, as though the harm they did was allowed or somehow deserving. They may blame the target of their actions. Certainly they're impulsive. We know young people are impulsive. That's nothing new. Either way, we need to make sure we're not enabling this behavior through not reporting it for discipline. And I think that really talks about what I mentioned earlier. So we have to kind of shift away from, is this just a rite of passage that, every kid goes through this at some point or another? I think we have to say no, that we have to have an environment at our schools, we have to have an environment where kids are that is doing a better job of training them on how to deal with aggression. And it is kind of not necessarily a losing battle, but it makes our job harder, because unless we are engaging them more often, and there'll be some folks out there who might not like the kind of, as we get into some of this parts of the presentation, but we start looking at video games and internet, we have to really start to think about unplugging our young people. The human brain is dynamic. It is evolving and growing so fast between birth and young adolescence. Even now we have studies that have really shown that young men and women are still very impulsive into their 20s. 22, 23, 24. So if we're not unplugging them and talking with them and getting them in tune with face-to-face communication, I think we really do them a disservice, because at some point they will have to interact with the real world. I was speaking last week to a group of community colleges, and one of the administrators had shared a situation at their campus where this young man had come in to the health center and had said, I'm depressed, I'm suicidal, I can't go on. And they said, okay, so what happened? Well, I met this wonderful girl. I mean, we we seemed to get along so well, and we talked every day and had so much in common, and she just broke up with me. I thought everything was perfect for the last 3 weeks, and kind of exploring some more about this relationship, and come to find out this young man and this young girl had never met face to face, had met online, had interacted, had formed a boyfriend-girlfriend type of relationship, had this intense relationship over the last couple weeks, and now she was no longer talking to him and had broken it off. And so here you have a young man who is talking about depression, is talking about suicidal as a result of a relationship that for a lot of us we would probably kind of go, what? I mean, you never met the person, you never saw them in person. For young people, the virtual world is very real to them, and I think that we have to develop a compelling narrative to maybe even compete with that, because if we don't, I think we do them a disservice. Okay. So how does cyberbullying differ? So we've got 4 types here that I'll talk about in terms of how cyberbullying has kind of changed from the physical aggression. What was interesting is when we look at the research, whether it's physical face-to-face aggression or cyberbullying, both sets of young people tend to have some common characteristics. They tend to be more often male than female. They tend to have generally an underlying issue, whether it's depression or anxiety or self-esteem issues. But what we have seen is in terms of suicidal thoughts and actual suicidal attempts is an increase from the cyberbullying side than the physical bullying side, about a 2% increase. So we'll see over the long term. I think it's important to remember that this is an area of study that really has just started. So in terms of long-term data, we really don't have a lot. So I'm going to go over 4 types: the vengeful angel, the power-hungry, or revenge of the nerds, mean girls, and then just inadvertent because they can. So let's talk about the vengeful angel. This is the young person, and I think that this is, before I get started with this, I think it's important to understand one of the reasons why parents and even us, we feel sometimes so uncomfortable is because we don't know. I mean, I'm sure most of us that are over 30 probably have a nephew, a niece, a neighborhood kid who's 12 years old who knows more about technology than we do, and that it's very unsettling. We have a problem with our phone or a problem with our computer. We don't call up a professional. We call the 15-year-old next door to come over and fix it because they've been living in this world. So the vengeful angel doesn't really even see themselves as a bully. They see themselves as this crusader, this righting the wrong. Now, whether it's directed against them or directed against someone else, they really are maybe not the most dangerous, but they get involved. And I think what makes cyberbullying so very different is if you have someone who is very tech savvy, this can go from one person to 1,000 people in a matter of minutes, which is very different. If I was an avenging angel 10 years ago and my friend at school was being bullied, I'd have to get involved personally, face to face. I'd have to confront that bully face to face, and there's a lot of risks associated with that. Not anymore. I could be tech savvy, cut and paste some pictures, send it out, Facebook, texting, the internet, and now all of a sudden I have done the work of 1,000 people in about 10 minutes. And there's a lot of interesting reports that you can find that talk about young people who have become the victims of this kind of incidentally. They weren't necessarily even involved in the original incident, and yet they've kind of gotten lumped into this attack. Certainly protecting a friend, someone else. I think this is an important piece. Talking about warranted revenge and teaching the other a lesson. How do we address that? Well, I think it really starts with parents. We have to educate our parents. We have to do a better job in terms of our curriculum at school. I certainly think, again, unplugging young people, particularly at those vulnerable ages when they're 4, 5, 6, and 7, and they're really learning those developmental milestones on how to interact with other people. We have to limit the amount of exposure that they have that promotes taking revenge against somebody because you feel wronged. These types of behaviors will have long-term consequences. We've been doing a series of presentations within the Orange County court system, particularly young boys and girls. And what's interesting is they are not aware of the long-term consequences. And if they are, they tend to dismiss them very easily. It doesn't matter if I avenge a friend and destroy someone else's life. They're not looking at those ramifications, and so it's something that that we have to address. So they need to know that no one should try and take justice into their own hands. I talked about that. I think the biggest piece with this slide here is they need to see themselves as bullies and not just a do-gooder. They are, in a sense, promoting the same behavior that they're advocating against. They need to understand that there are other ways to handle a situation, a confrontation. Unfortunately, I think the media is somewhat to blame. I think that we look at incidents like WikiLeaks and some of these other examples in the media where people have taken information and, whether intentionally or maybe unintentionally, sent it out into cyberspace, and it actually has consequences. Information has consequences. I think for young people, getting them to understand that is the challenge, because we're no longer talking about something that may happen face-to-face and with our memories is forgotten. We're talking about a digital record that stays there forever, and something that they have done when they were impulsive at 15 could have a very long-term effect when they hit 21 or 18 and they want to get a job, or they want to go into the military, or they want to go work for a particular company, or even get into college. Instead of blaming them, we also want to make sure that the situation that they see as the problem is addressed. We have to, if they see something going on at a campus, if they see some perceived wrong, we have to include them into the conversation on how we can fix it and get them involved. I think that that's a very important piece. Otherwise, it's just going to continue to take on a more viral, mean-spirited tone. Peer groups, administrators, are we ignoring it or are we taking it seriously? So, again, it kind of falls back to us. All right, power hungry. They want to exert authority. They want to show that they are in control, that they can make others do what they want. Now, They need an audience. Could be that they just don't like the other person. The scary thing virtually is we have a couple high-profile cases recently where the bully wasn't even a young person, it was actually an adult. And it resulted in the suicide of a young girl. So it's really important, I think, to make sure that we're educating our young people about this. Often the power they feel is not enough. So they're going to brag about their actions, and they're looking for a reaction. They want that feedback. I think with power hungry, what we will see as our kind of research into this area continues, we will find that these young people are coming from a background where this behavior is being modeled for them. They're seeing it in their family structures, and then they're acting it out online. Typically, they can be a victim of physical bullying at an organization. They can be female, physically smaller. I think that that's an important distinction to make. When we look at cyberbullying, the numbers are pretty close in terms of male and female. So it's not limited to just men. So their intention, frighten and embarrass their victims. They're empowered by the anonymity of the internet and digital communications and the fact that they never have to confront their victim. Part of what we have to do as educators is tell them that there is no anonymity. When you send it out, it's a record. It's there. And certainly local law enforcement agencies, the Federal Trade Communications, FBI, have individuals that are extremely adept at tracking down where a message comes from. And I think that's part of the impulse control areas that we have to address. So they may act tough, but they're not. And they are often not a bullying, but just plain one. They don't really see it necessarily as anything wrong. This talks about, this kind of revenge of the nerds. I think that this is an evolution of how young people feel powerless sometimes, and how we have in the past maybe accepted intimidation and aggression as kind of part of that growing up experience, and I think we're learning that it really shouldn't be. And now young people who are very technical now have an outlet for a lot of that emotion, a lot of that anxiety, depression, a lot of that anger, a lot of that fear, and we have to do a better job of addressing it. Okay, mean girls. Looking for entertainment, ego-based, most immature, slumber parties, get-togethers, something fun to do. And I think this one really speaks to our fascination with media in general. Unfortunately, reality TV was great when it first came out. We loved it. It was interesting. It was exciting. And we didn't realize that 10, 15 years down the road it would have some consequences. The reality of promoting aggression or promoting maladaptive behavior or poor communication is that when young people are exposed to it over and over, they start to view it as normal. They start to incorporate that as, well, this is how it's okay for all of these adults to act this way, why can't I? And unfortunately, unless we're unplugging them or unless we're having those conversations, then these are the types of activities that take place. You get a bunch of young people, they get together, they're very tech savvy, they get bored. When young people get bored, they want an outlet for that energy. Well, they've got this wonderful laptop, there's no parents around, peer pressure takes over, and it's very easy to find a victim or a target and do something that if they had to interact with that person face to face, they may never do. I think that that's one of the salient issues about the internet is there's a false sense of anonymity for young people. They get the sense that, well, you know, it's just online. You know, there's no consequences to it. They don't see the immediate reaction of another person being hurt or humiliated in front of them. This is something that that they're not even thinking about, because it's just sent off. It's a keystroke somewhere. It's a click of a mouse, and they don't realize how difficult it can be. Done for entertainment. Talked about that. Certainly an audience. You know, these types of cyberbullies want others to know who they are, that they have the power, and what they're doing. And so this is something that's not going to stay a secret. And so as parents, as providers, as educators, you name it, when we find out about these, we have to take action right away. We have to address it. All right, professionals. So we want to avoid reacting with anger or expressions of disappointment. Certainly aggressive youth already believe that others don't like them, and they get punished because of adults' feelings about them rather than their actions. So we don't want, again, we don't want, starting to stumble. We don't want to promote anger and this aggression as a way of dealing with a situation. Right? We want to reaffirm that there are other ways to handle bad behavior. I can be genuine to someone and still disapprove of their behavior and their actions at the same time, and I think that that's very important. Here's a big piece. Young people don't tell them because they're afraid that we're not going to do anything about it, that we're not going to protect them. Right? They see that they're not going to be protected from retaliation. What a terrible place to be. A terrible place to be for a young person who feels overwhelmed, the sense of fear, the sense of shame or embarrassment, whatever might be going on, and then to have the idea that if they were to tell somebody or reach out for help, that there would be nobody there to protect them. And I think that that falls on us. It's a very sad state of affairs, and we need to do a better job of making sure that any time a young person talks to us about an incident, whether it's face-to-face or digital, about unwarranted aggression or any type of inappropriate behavior, that we have to take action. We have to do something about it. We have to make them feel safe and protected. Otherwise, they're just not going to talk to us. They're not going to let us know. Here's some hints that we can see. They don't go outside. They avoid gym, using a nurse's bathroom, calling in sick. Right? We can see these behaviors. We may attribute them to other things, but I think that part of the screening that we have to do as professionals now is to start having those conversations with young people about aggression and about bullying, and has it happened? Because it could be depression, but it also could be that they have undergone a Facebook attack from someone that they know. And so the reality is they need us to stop the bullying more than they need our advice. They need that protection. And that can be challenging in a virtual world, but not impossible. All right, so we talked about the protection from retaliation. They certainly need to know that it's not their fault, that they didn't do anything that warranted it necessarily, that handling aggression, handling those types of situations should be addressed. as if an adult, when we start talking about sexual harassment, we don't tolerate it in the workplace. We spend lots of time and energy educating our employees and our managers that this type of behavior is unacceptable. And we have to have those types of programs in our schools as well. Okay, so here's some steps. 1, focus on the social environment. Reduce bullying is another full-time job that we're going to have to do, certainly in terms of education and as clinical providers. It has to be uncool to bully. And I've got some resources that I've linked to that have some wonderful little web clips, some cartoons. I think that we do see this kind of gaining national attention, and so there's a lot of free information out there, and I'll talk about that kind of at the end, where you can access some of that and use it. This requires everyone: teachers, administrators, counselors, bus drivers, nurses, school resource officers. It is an entire effort, and it's an entire shift in thinking. It is no longer a rite of passage. It is inappropriate behavior that we need to address across the entire spectrum. All right, looking at your school, because this is primarily where it's going to take place. We want to make sure that if we're going to survey students, get an idea of what's going on at the school, I think it's really important to involve the young people because they're going to be the best barometer for what's going on in their environment. I think sometimes we have a tendency to not involve young people. We sometimes tend to dismiss their input, but I found that it can be very valuable. And I find sometimes that certainly when we start talking about kind of creating a campaign to address this issue, without their involvement, I don't think it's as effective. So when we're gathering data, I think it's really important to make sure that we're including young people in that process. Okay. We have to have support, not only from the staff, but from parents as well. PTA, athletic activities, your clubs. It really has to get everybody involved. Remember, we're talking about an entire shift away from, I think, culturally what was perceived as just this cultural norm to it's not something that should be tolerated. And so that takes everybody on every level to be involved. Form a group. Might include, the janitors, the non-teaching staff. Again, I think students need to be involved in this in terms of different strategies and rules. A student advisory group, certainly very important. And I got some resources in the back that will kind of help with this. We want to train our staff in bullying prevention. Training, and unfortunately, we live in a time of reducing budgets and cutbacks and furloughs and layoffs, and that makes it difficult when we want to talk about training. But I think everyone can probably agree that, well, what's the cost of a child's life? Right? If we keep one child from committing suicide as a result of bullying, was the training worth it? And I would say yes. So we have to train, we have to educate, we have to kind of reinforce that message. We cannot just have the afternoon presentation once a year. It doesn't do the job. We have to be actively involved in changing the mindset of our community. Establish and enforce school rules and policies related to bullying. Again, we want to make sure that this behavior isn't tolerated, that if it occurs, that we're following the policies. And that doesn't matter if it's the valedictorian or the star football player. We have to make sure that we're not going to tolerate bullies, and certainly make sure that students that are bullies feel that sense of protection. Because if we don't, then they don't talk about their depression, they don't talk about their isolation, and we see studies where it plays out. Young people who don't feel protected, that don't feel they have anywhere to go, are more isolated. They're more likely to have a successful suicide. Because why would I talk to anybody about how I feel if nobody protected me? So I think that that's really important. Increase adult supervision. Well, it's hard for bullying to take place if there's an adult. And this applies not only to the physical world, but to the digital world. If you have a bunch of young girls coming over for a slumber party, let them play Monopoly. Take away the laptop, take away the computer, let them interact face to face. You know, we did it for hundreds of years, and we seem to have gotten this far. So one night in the 21st century, I don't think is going to have a traumatic effect. I think that that's sometimes our fault, is we're too afraid to fight that battle with our kids when we want to take something away. We don't want to fight that no battle, and we have to do it more often, because if you leave a group of young people unsupervised with access to technology, well, I think you can expect that they're going to access technology. It may be positive, it may be negative, but without supervision, I think we run the risk more on the negative side. Physical world, young people are going to be pretty reluctant to go up and bully somebody if there's an adult in the area. It just doesn't happen. Why? Because they know it's wrong. They know we don't condone it. But we've got to do a better job of being seen. Intervene consistently and appropriately in situations. 1 to 2 minutes. Right? We have to make sure that we stop it right away. If we see it, we take action. We do something about it. We then take those individuals and get them involved in terms of, hey, let's talk about it. Meet with them separately, talk about what it's like to be bullied, what it's like to be a bully, right? And then involve the parents. And this is always a challenge. You know, my mom works in education, and she's always expressing the frustration of parental involvement, and that will continue to be a challenge that we will have to work through as providers, whether we're in education or whether we're psychologists or therapists, or you know, we're always going to have to deal with that parental system. And if we don't have buy-in from the parental system, we're going to have to find some creative ways to work with that young person outside of it, so that they learn appropriate ways to deal with aggression, that they learn appropriate ways to deal with confrontation. Focus some class time. You know, I imagine at some point, as I do enough of these web presentations, I'll probably get myself in trouble, and that's okay, I don't mind, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that at some point our education system is going to have to move away from a 1940s agricultural model of educating our young people. We do the same thing over and over and over and over again, and yet we're still getting pretty poor results. It's the 21st century. We should have a lot of conversations, a lot of class time devoted to the internet, to social networking, to social media, how to interact face to face, how to What do you do when you're stalked online or you receive inappropriate material? We're not doing enough of this. Unfortunately, I think we're doing a poor job of moving away from that model, and we're getting lapped. If you look at some of the recent stories about China and Asia, we find that these countries are kicking our butt, as it were, in terms of education, and so we've got to make some changes, or we're just going to get left behind. So we've got to certainly put the effort in terms of educating young people. It has to be part of the curriculum, has to be part of the conversation. Anti-bullying themes and messages certainly incorporated not only in the curriculum but throughout the school. And for any of you that are connected to a school or connected to a PTA, I'm going to give you a site at the end of this presentation where you can order as many free materials as you want. They won't even charge you shipping and handling. You just fill out a little form online. They will send you hundreds of free materials. This is our tax dollars hard at work. Take advantage of it. Order these. Hand them out at your schools. Give them to your principals. Give them to your teachers. And start it young. I mean, these materials are age appropriate from kindergarten and up. So I encourage everyone to do that. And then certainly there's no end date. Bullying is not going to magically disappear. Cyberbullying isn't going to go away anytime soon. It's probably going to evolve. And now we're going to talk about social media. I put this little clip up here for a reason, and I want you to kind of bear with me for a second. This is actually a device that's undergoing clinical trials right now for treatment of depression. What you have here is you have a tiny implant in the back of the neck that has a battery, and it sends a nice little electrical charge up and down into our areas of our brain that control depression and serotonin, so it activates more of the serotonin receptors in our brain. So for individuals who have chronic depression and your traditional therapies aren't working, this has actually been a somewhat successful way to treat depression. Well, I'm not talking about depression today, but what's interesting is I liked this because it kind of gives a unique illustration about how plugged in we are to the digital world. It really does sometimes seem like it's going directly into our brain. And maybe that's the next evolution, is we no longer have cell phones. We just have a little implant in our ear, and you know, when the call comes in, we wiggle our nose or pull on our ear, and the phone answers. I don't know, but you know, we are seeing a dramatic increase in integration between technology and human beings. So I thought that was an interesting kind of highlight how connected we are to technology. You know, here are some of the trends. Certainly, when we look at reality TV, you know, young people, I would not let any young person under the age of 18 watch any of this stuff because it sends a false message. These shows, and these are just a few, there's dozens more, but they promote the idea that you can be aggressive, that you can engage actually in criminal behavior, and that there's no consequences. I'll give you an example. Jersey Shore, I think it was last year or the year before, one of the episodes, they have a young man on there, and he gets upset at someone else that had given him a look or had done something, and so he walks up to the young man and just hits him. And everybody is celebrating and talking about how amazing he is, and the young man actually fell onto the ground, had hit his head, and suffered some pretty serious injuries. And so the episode gets played out over the media, and it's just this, look at how tough this guy is, look at how great, and you know, wow, he handled that confrontation really well. And what you don't see is the aftermath of that. The young people don't understand that this young man then he was arrested, he was processed through the local jail system, he faced charges, he recently went to court. I don't know the outcome of the court case, but it had a very serious long-term effect. But we don't see that. We see this, oh, look, it's okay if you have a disagreement with somebody to just go up and hit them and knock them out, and what a tough guy you are, and now all of a sudden you're everybody's favorite person. So children learn by exposure, and so we have to limit that exposure to really have an effect. Games, you know, the first-person shooter games, the violence, the gore, it has a desensitizing effect on young people. You know, we know that young people who, if we expose them to enough violence, violence becomes a norm. We know this through our domestic violence studies. Individuals who grow up in a domestic violence situation or a physical abuse situation are extremely likely to become perpetrators of domestic violence or perpetrators of physical abuse. We know this. We've known it for years. So it's no surprise that young people who are constantly bombarded and exposed to this violence and this behavior are going to replicate it. All right, 72 studies that gauged empathy among 14,000 college students over the past 30 years. I thought this was really sad. A 40% decrease since the year 2000. And it's interesting when we look at that, the year 2000 was actually where the internet had really started to take off. It really started to grow, where it started to become involved in a lot more households. We started to get a lot more cable TV. We started to get reality TV. We see these correlations now with young people where, gosh, they're just not as empathetic. We're not teaching them care and concern for your fellow man. I think that's a really sad statement on our part. Lack of face-to-face communication. Well, if I don't see you, I don't have to be as empathetic. If I have to see you face-to-face and confront you, I can see and experience those emotions. And if it's hurtful to another person, it's going to affect me in some way. And so by taking out the face-to-face communication, we eliminate that learning, that when I say something, it actually has consequences and can be hurtful. The internet and housing boom. You know, it's interesting when you talk to older generations, they will tell you that when they grew up, they knew everyone in their neighborhood. They did. They knew their neighbors. You know, it was a much smaller community. And my generation, I think I'm in Generation X. I'm not sure. X, Y, one of those. I think I'm a letter. The generation that we tend to talk about now, we call them millennials. So I've lost count. But my generation is, I can say that, you know, part of that's our fault. I mean, I don't know my neighbors. I live in a community, and you know, everybody tends to be very insular and isolated, and so I'm partly to blame for that. So we have to get out, I think, more and encourage that face-to-face. Social networking sites, if you really look at it, certainly from a clinical perspective, we're creating a generation of narcissists. We're creating a bunch of folk where it's all about us. I mean, if you think about Facebook and why it's so popular, it's all about the individual. Look at me. Look at what I did. Look at what I've posted. You know, me, 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 me. You know, for those of us who grew up without it, we could disconnect from it pretty easily. It wouldn't be so traumatic in our lives. But for young people, now they've grown up with it, it's all they know, it's become an object relation to them. How could they ever give it up? It's part of their life. It's part of who they are. They've formed an identity around it. If you ask young people, they are not in a relationship until it has been posted to Facebook. Think about that. I can't tell you that I'm your friend, boyfriend, girlfriend, or whatever. I can't tell you that until we announce it to the world, post it on Facebook. Pretty scary. So, just some things to kind of keep in mind. In children, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, suicide. We see these are comorbid with certainly eating disorders, self-injuring disorders, and they are a result of that isolation, that loneliness, that sense of not being protected, and that kind of fallout of being bullied. Addiction, 30% increase in drug experimentation from those that have been the victim of a bully. And if you think about that, it makes a lot of sense. If I'm not being protected, if I feel victimized, I'm going to love any kind of escape you can give me from feeling that way, whether it's alcohol or drugs. Alarmingly enough, it is no longer high school where we have to have conversations about drug use. It is shifted way down to middle school and even beyond. If you look at some of the numbers that come out of addiction studies, that come out of law enforcement, we see an alarming trend of young people as young as 8 years old with their first experimentation with alcohol and or other drugs. That's really scary, 8 years old. Freaks the hell out of me because my daughter's 5 and 8 is 3 years away and I'm scared to death. But again, we have to have those conversations a lot sooner and a lot longer. It cannot be, okay, don't do drugs. Any questions? No? All right, and move on. It has to be continual. You know, it has to be part of the educational environment. It has to be part of the family environment. You have to have those conversations daily, weekly. I mean, it just has to be an ongoing, rolling dialogue. And also for if you've got young kids, we've got to disconnect them. We've got to go out and do things as a family, as a social unit, without the internet. Even if that means for us, we have to tell our boss, I'm sorry, I will not be available for the next 72 hours because I'm leaving my phone at home. How can we expect our kids to unplug if we're at the park BlackBerrying our office? It was amazing how much things still got done before BlackBerry, and they still will get done. So I think it's important that we set that example. And it, like I said, it begins at home. Parents, 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 right? We have to teach empathy, kindness, make sure that it's never okay to bully or use physical violence to solve a problem. And certainly reinforce that we will be there to protect them. I think that that's key. If our kids cannot trust us to protect them, why would they ever come to us when they have a problem? These are some of the sites. Stop bullying. It's hard to see. Stop bullying now. In terms of how to. This one has a lot of cartoons and videos. This one here, this NetCentra, this is part of the Federal Trade Communications here, and you can go there and order. They have CDs, they have DVDs, they have posters, they have booklets, they have a whole community toolkit on how to not only talk about bullying, but also just interacting with the internet in general. Sexting, social media, all of it. And it's free. It's absolutely free. You can order as many, as few or as many as you want. By the hundreds. By the hundreds. So certainly take advantage of that. I think it always helps to have material if we're going to start addressing this. So that's kind of the presentation. I'd love some questions now, and we'll take questions from the audience here and any questions from the audience online. Where do we want to start? All right, any questions here? Yes, ma'am.
I think about the impact about what you're saying in terms of parents,
Mm-hmm.
because I really do believe it starts at the home. Hello. I do agree with you about everything that you said as parents, and I think our duty as educators and in mental health, we have responsibility to do workshops at the schools for parents and parent education.
Yep.
Because I just think that parents just don't understand, realize the impact
Absolutely.
that they have, and how important it is to have dinner
Absolutely.
and all that stuff. And so I'm looking for, and I guess my question to you would be, do you see as a clinician the possibility of doing workshops for parents in terms of education and on the impact that they have on their lives of their children and their families?
I'd be willing to, maybe not guarantee, but I'd be willing to bet that if you're a clinician in your area and you go to your local school and you set up an appointment with the principal and say, "Hi, I am Joshua. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work with the County of Orange, and I'd like to come down on Tuesday night or whenever your schedule's available and just do a 20-minute, 30-minute presentation, hand out some free materials on bullying, and I'll do it for free." They will probably have you busier than you'll want to be. But we have to do that. I think you're absolutely right that as professionals, and it's actually, I think, in our code of ethics that we should be doing pro bono work. I mean, this is part of the responsibility of being a professional, of having this information, is we have to get it out there. So yeah, I think if you were to do that, the school districts, certainly here in Orange County and beyond, would love it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I was really interested, by the way, thank you, excellent job.
You're very welcome.
Really interested by the University of Michigan study that you noted with the lack of empathy. And you'd also referenced a situation where I believe it was a suicide victim whose bully was an adult. With that generation of people that don't have have 40% less empathy or whatever the figure was, do you see as that generation grows, do you see there being an increase in adult bullying, or is that already happening?
Well, I think what we will see is an increase in adults getting involved in the legal system as a result of aggressive behaviors. We see increases in road rage incidents. We see increases in assaults and batteries. So I think we will. The challenge, certainly when it comes to the internet, and we look at this study, in 2000, that's 11 years. We're probably 10 years or 15 years away from having kind of those long-term results. But it's starting to play out. When we look at that lack of face-to-face communication, that lack of empathy, we see it. Unfortunately, I think most of us here in the room, and probably most people that are online, have probably had a situation in their life where they have seen something where, wow, what a lack of empathy, what an overreaction to what might be considered very minor. There was, last year, there was a lady caught on camera at Walmart, young lady, probably my generation, just physically assaulting her kids in the car from some perceived slight. And so that's kind of, I think, a reflection of that study, is that lack of empathy has kind of played out now, where if we don't have as much regard for others, then we're more likely to be aggressive and have that inappropriate behavior.
We do have one question online. The question is, what would your approach be if the parents refuse to get involved?
I might get in trouble for this statement, but I'll say it anyway. Anybody can be a parent, whether they should be or not. If they don't get involved, I think, unless it's, certainly as a professional, it falls into one of our reporting categories for child abuse, there's not a lot we can do. We can work with that child when they're kind of within our sphere of influence, in terms of schools or in a clinic or in a hospital. But outside of that, when they go home and they don't want to be involved, our hands are tied. So I don't really have an easy answer to what we do with parents that don't want to be parents. There's a question in the back.
When we talk about the bullying here with its kids, it's minors, and so I was thinking about two things I was thinking about. How, and you kind of approached it with that it's road rage and aggression and all those things that, you know, we start seeing people who are adult bullies now get in trouble with the court, like you told us about that 60%. But I was wondering if you see a problem with the prosecution, because I know with kids they've started putting charges on them if they bully physically, you know. But with the virtual cyberbullying, it's a freedom of speech issue, isn't it?
Well, here's the challenge, and this applies not only just to the bullying, but also to sexting, which is another kind of new phenomenon in our digital world. The challenge is that technology has moved so fast that our laws haven't had a chance to catch up. You know, we're looking at 1940s in terms of our child pornography laws. They had no concept of the internet, and so now if you have a 16 and a 16-year-old exchanging inappropriate material through the internet, it falls under federal child pornography statutes. They could be prosecuted for it. They could have to register as a sex offender. I mean, there are potentially long-term consequences for it because those are the laws on the books. They haven't caught up yet. So I think that that's part of the job of our legislature and part of us as citizens is to be involved in creating that dialogue so that we have to change. It's kind of like what I said about the education system. We've got to change it. We've got to adapt it to a 21st century, or we're going to get left behind. And the same thing with our laws on these areas when it comes to bullying and cyberbullying. Yeah, you have a right to say what you want to say, but I don't think you have a right to maliciously attack someone virtually and get everybody involved to the point where it causes someone to commit suicide. And that'll take some time to work out. So.
I have another question. The question is, my 5th grade son is being bullied by a couple of girls. Should we treat this any different if it's boys?
No, not at all. Girls can be just as mean as boys. It really should be less about the gender and more about the behavior. If the behavior is inappropriate, it has to be addressed. We love our stereotypical societal roles, and I do too. I mean, you know, I'm a father, got a young girl. I want her to be a princess. You know, I'm always talking about, oh, my little princess, you know, this very, you know, gender-specific role. So we do that. But in terms of aggressive behavior and inappropriate conduct, I think it doesn't matter whether it's a boy or a girl. We have to address it the same. Because those young girls are going to become older girls, and then they have to realize that that type of behavior is inappropriate. If we start, and this is gosh, you know, the solutions are actually quite simple. If we start young enough, it will take hold. It's when we don't and we try and address it when they're teenagers that it becomes harder to address. If we start when they're in 5th grade or younger to address this behavior, then it's not manifested when they're teenagers and they want to assert their independence and they're not then getting involved with the criminal justice system. So I don't think it makes any difference in terms of gender. Inappropriate behavior is inappropriate behavior.
Just another quick question. Do you feel that corporations should get more involved? I mean, you mentioned Facebook a lot, MySpace, Twitter. At what point do they get involved if, you know,
I think
is it
corporations...
their responsibility or...
Yeah, I think corporations should look at it from the perspective of their future employees. If they don't want to have to spend the money researching all of the backgrounds in YouTubes and Facebook posts that their future employees have made, start now, start young, and then you reduce or you mitigate that risk that the next person that you hire for your corporation is going to have an inappropriate YouTube video pop up right before a big contract or something. You know, I mean, I think that that's important. Corporations have a long history. They certainly got involved with drugs. They're, you know, the anti-drug campaign. They're involved with breast cancer. You know, I would love to see corporations get more involved not only with bullying but also mental health issues. You know, we raise billions of dollars for cancer research every year. I mean, you can get the whole NFL, these big burly guys wearing pink, and we raise billions of dollars. And yet, the amount of money that we raise for schizophrenia or depression or PTSD is minuscule compared to that. So I'd love to see corporations get more behind the idea that mental health is a disease. It is a system in the body that has malfunctioned. It's harder to see, it's harder to treat, we have a lot of stigma, it's harder to understand, but it is still a system within the body where something is going wrong, and I'd love to see corporations kind of get behind that and help us raise more money to treat it. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone online who was here and participated. I hope the folks that view this later enjoy the material. I want to thank Dr. Grimes and Cal Southern for having me down. It's just been wonderful. And you know, please feel free to contact me. My contact information will be posted associated with this presentation. More than happy to answer questions either on the phone or by email. So thank you very much.